Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next lecture on the literature review for the MALCS course 7012 Dissertation Seminar. Okay, so let's dive right into it. So today we're going to do a little bit of admin. I'm just going to explain what's going on, uh, even though things are still a bit unclear. And then I'm just going to do a short review of the research problem argumentation. And I think a lot of you are pretty much, well, at least from the worksheets that were submitted, it seems like you're pretty on track. Okay, so today the main focus is going to be on literature reviews, their importance, how they work, how to kind of write them, design them, especially for your overall project. And then last, I'm going to do a kind of a workshop on how to do note taking, what's called the SQ3R method. Okay, all right, so admin first. So as you noticed from Moodle, okay, on February 21st, so that's 11 days from now, I want you to submit an annotated bibliography. So here, let me make this a little bigger. An annotated bibliography is basically a bibliography with a short abstract. So an abstract's like, I don't know, 100 to 200 words, summarizing what the argument is in that source. Okay, you can also, if it's an article or a book or something like that, you can look at the abstracts that were already written for it. But I want you to write it in your own words, and you want to make it clear, at least with one sentence, how this applies to your research or how it will help you in your research. Okay. So, and then on February 28th, which is 7 days later, I want you to submit a actual 500 to 750 word review of a book, okay, of a book or a scholarly article. So this I want to be written in the literature review style. All right, so that it would actually be better if you do more than one more than one source, really, where you're talking about how these sources kind of go together. So typically for this course, we ask that you only do one, but I think it's in your best interest to present at least a coherent literature review of more than one source, maybe 1 to 3, where you're discussing a particular research question and you're kind of talking about how these sources contribute to your understanding of that and point you in a different direction about how to kind of address the research question. Okay, so you can think of it as a challenge. Now you can do just a review of just one scholarly article or book, okay, with the description of the main argument, evaluation of its argument and conclusions, consideration of its place within the body of scholarly literature on the topic, and appraisal of its usefulness for your dissertation. You can do just one, or you can do 2, 3, 4, 5, however many you want to do, okay, and I will read it and I'll give you. But the thing is that you're going to have to review more than one piece of literature for your dissertation, so you might as well do multiple ones together and link them together in an overall argument. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about how to do that today in this lecture, but for the basic minimum requirement of the assignment, you only have to do one piece of literature, but I recommend that you do multiple. Right? Especially because this will end up being the main kind of body of your introduction for your dissertation, where you're kind of identifying the research problem, explaining what other scholars have said about it and how they address it, and then how that applies to the way that you're going to address the research question. Okay? All right, so that's why I'm saying I recommend that you consider doing a longer version just for your own benefit, especially because you're going to have more time. Right, so we don't have class on February 17th or February 24th. Those classes have been canceled. There will be no online courses and there will be no in-class meetings. Okay, so also that means that our workshop at the library has been postponed. I don't know when that will be made up. I'll have to, once we know exactly what's going to happen with the schedule, then I'll get back to you on that. Okay, and then also your guest lecture from Professor Stacy Ford also has been postponed. So officially, we're supposed to start meeting again on March 2nd, which was also when you're supposed to give a presentation of that one piece of literature and explain how it applies to your research. So ideally, we can still do that, but let's wait and see, and I'll update you through Moodle. Okay. All right. Secondly, so make sure that you submit an annotated bibliography and then a literature review of at least one source, but better to do multiple. Okay, all right. Let's see. Okay, back to this. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Another thing too is that one, we don't know if we're going to meet in person or not. I wanted to give you this option to use Zoom for online teaching. So right now we only have 9 responses, which is and one of those responses is mine. So really we only have 8 responses, which means I need the rest of you to vote, okay, on whether or not you want to use Zoom. Right now it's very close, 4-3. Those of you, if you don't have a preference, that's okay, right? So that way we can kind of decide. There was also this question of whether or not you want to use pre-recorded videos giving feedback on assignments. Normally what I would have done is in class we would have met and I would have sat down with each of you individually and talked about your and given you feedback on what you've written so far. Today I guess what I'll do is I'll do some pre-recorded videos and I'll send those out to you and I'll post those later. Okay? All right. But I'm only going to do one, either that or written feedback, because they both take time. All right, so on to review of research problem argumentation. Okay, so we talked about this last week. So you're always going to start with your kind of practical problem, which is, there's something that I have an itch, something that I don't understand, and that motivates your research question. And that research question then begins to define the way you're going to address your research problem. So your research problem and your practical problem are not the same thing. Okay, but your practical problem is what motivates you down this road to research. Okay, and the research problem will then help you kind of find a research answer, which will then solve that practical problem. Okay, so most people start here, and they think that the practical problem, is the research problem, but it's not the same. Okay, because you do need to go through this question of what is the research question. So this takes work. Okay, and a lot of this work is done through the literature review. So that's why we're going to focus on literature review and how important it is. But another thing that's very important to understand is, at least the way I see it, okay, is the literature review is a big part of the research, especially in the humanities, because what we do is we end up doing some sort of analysis of that text. And while other people in other fields like social sciences, for them the research is locating the source and analyzing that source. But in my mind, at least, a lot of times the research that gets done in the humanities is reading up on the pertinent literature first and understanding the state of the field and the particular research question. And that is almost the bulk of the research. And then finally, then you have a real kind of important question. Then you would actually analyze the literature or the film or the game or the cultural text, because locating that cultural text is not that difficult when it comes to literary studies, for example. Now, if you're an ethnographer and you need to go into the field and let's say go to villages in Yunnan, and find folk music, then that's the research, okay? But for us, the texts are not that hard to find, and so really a lot of the research comes into doing the literature review, which is right here, okay? Looking for the correct research question or the best research question for addressing what you're trying to understand and defining the research problem. Okay, so the research problem will then lead you to the kind of investigation you're doing about that text, and then once you conduct that investigation, right? So that's your methodology, and your mode of a sort of analysis. That will lead you to a research answer which addresses that practical problem. Okay, all right. So, like we said, research problems motivated not by palpable unhappiness, but by incomplete knowledge or flawed understanding. So you solve it not by changing the world, but by understanding it better. But then by understanding it better, that's where the change in the world can happen. Okay? So that's why it's important to understand, and why I ask you to do this research argumentation, where you identify the topic, come up with the question, and then find the conceptual significance and a potential practical application. Okay? So I gave you a template. So I want you to be able to use that. And this is very important, and you'll be writing this into your introduction, okay? And you'll be focusing more on certain questions like the potential practical application more in the conclusion of your dissertation, okay? Jesse came up with a really good question, so I wanted to talk about that today. She wanted to ask, what's the difference between the conceptual significance as opposed to the question? And Jesse had a little bit of trouble understanding the difference, and also the potential practical applications. So how did these three differentiate each other? And I can understand why that might be an issue, because I want to find out how politicians use stories of great events to shape public opinion. Might seem not that different from, in order to help readers understand how politicians use elements of popular culture to advance their political goals. Okay, but here's the thing. Okay, the question and the conceptual significance are different, because the question is, what's going on? Why is this happening, right? And then the conceptual significance is, this is a tool. The concept is a tool. It's significant because it can help you understand by looking at something specific, okay? So the question is, how do politicians use, in this example, how do politicians use stories, okay? And the conceptual significance is they use elements of popular culture to advance political goals. All right, so the conceptual significance is linking something together. So Jesse's example, I think, was really good. So I'm going to focus on that. So Jesse's question is, how people use female bodies as a site of resistance against the government authority, and how does it influence people's perception of female empowerment and female agency? So yeah, that's a very good question. It's like, how do female bodies or representations of female bodies get used for political or cultural politics, okay? Now, the conceptual significance that Jesse writes is help readers understand how Hong Kong protesters comment on gender and sexuality, especially the significance of the body and the condemnation of sexual violence. Okay, so this is not that strong, okay, because helping readers understand is actually still part of the research question. Okay, the question is, how do readers comment on, or how do Hong Kong protesters comment, okay, using female bodies? That's still the question. But the significance of the body is the conceptual significance, okay? That's the methodology. So analyzing representations of the female body in political discourse, that's what's conceptually happening. Okay, so this is different from the question. The question is, how do bodies get used? The concept is focusing on the bodies and what do bodies do. Okay, so basically a reader, when they understand the conceptual significance, they will be able to use it as a methodology, and they understand why that methodology is useful. Okay, why is it significance? So this is the way I would have rephrased it. In order to help readers understand how images of the female body are used to mobilize political discourse. So when someone understands your conceptual significance, then they also know how to use your methodology to apply it to their research question. So in this case, the conceptual significance is the female body. If you understand it and analyze how it's represented, then you can use that to understand political discourse and how it's mobilized in different ways, whether that's in Hong Kong protest movements or in, I don't know, like an Oscar campaign for, like a movie or something, or, the ways that women's bodies are used when it comes to selling cosmetics or something like that. Okay. So then the potential practical application that Jesse wrote is so that readers can better understand the mechanism of the movement propaganda. Now, for me, this is actually the conceptual significance. Being able to understand the mechanism, how something works, okay? That's the conceptual significance, okay? Whereas express themselves and contribute to the protection of human rights as well as the empowerment of women, that is practical, but it's a bit vague. So a practical application might be something like so that they can, draw attention to, how women are being used in certain ways or something like that. Okay, the practical application is kind of up to you, and you can think it over on your own. Okay, I'm not super concerned about the practical application, but I think that the practical application should go back to, in a certain way, your original practical problem. Like, why is it that you want to understand that question in the first place? For some that might be like, oh, I want to understand, why I'm so drawn to these books about existential questions, or, why I'm so interested in, a certain type of movie or something like that. Okay. So, but the practical application is kind of limitless. And one very strong kind of practical application you could use for Jesse's example, and I think I wrote this here, is something like, well, if you understand that how women's bodies and representations of women's bodies are being used in movement propaganda, then a practical application could be something like, well, then you can then indicate to people who are doing this how their work alienates those who might be supportive of their movement otherwise. So for example, right, like if I'm considering supporting a certain movement, but then I look at the image and for me it's super sexist, then it would be really useful and practical for that group of, people who are creating this movement material to understand, because then they might not alienate other people who might see things as sexist or, offensive in some way. So that's a potential practical application. Okay, so now you understand. Conceptual significance is about the methodology. Okay, all right, cool. So yeah, so I thought that most of you had pretty good topic, and this question of what you want to find out, and we're really kind of getting to the point where we're identifying some significant concept that will help you analyze the text. Whereas the potential practical application, you're going to have to think that a bit more. And kind of, but don't worry, that is something that happens more in your conclusion. Okay, all right. So last week we stopped with this question: How do you find a good research problem? So let me see how much time we've used so far. Okay, I don't have a timer. Okay, I'll just try to go faster. How do you find a good research problem? The literature review. Okay, I cannot emphasize enough how important the literature review is. Okay, because the literature review tells you what other people have already found. What are their findings, okay? And how have they tried to address your research question? So it's really kind of educating yourself, but also it's not just educating yourself, but after you have educated yourself by doing all the reading, writing it up and summarizing it in a way so that other people understand the state of the field and why your particular approach to the research problem is appropriate. So one, establish the status quo. Know what's going on, right? So if you think of the research field as like let's say it's a battlefield, okay? Or, you can think of it like a chessboard or something like that. You have a field and you need to know what's going on in that field. You can't just, without looking at the field and analyzing it, you can't just be like, well, I'm going to help this field and my agenda by doing this, addressing this research. Well, if you don't know what's going on in the field already, how are you going to contribute? So the key with the literature review is not only are you identifying what is the kind of most appropriate way to understand this research and analyze it, but also it helps you understand what other people have already done. So when people say research is standing on the shoulders of giants, well, this is you climbing onto that giant and standing up. You need to navigate what they've been through. You understand what they've studied, so that you can contribute and kind of add. So eventually people can also stand on your back too, okay? So this also helps you formulate the problem or the research inquiry. Like, it's important to understand, why is it that other people are studying this problem this way? And I think that this is really kind of, I don't want to say common sense, but it makes a lot of practical sense when we think about it in terms of other fields like, science, like sciences or research. Like, let's say you're studying climate change. And and your practical problem is, I want to understand why it is that our climate is getting worse, or becoming less stable for human habitation. Now, if you were actually to do that study, you wouldn't just be like, well, I'm going to study it by, taking temperatures in the ozone layer or something like that. Because how do you know that that's useful? How do you know that that's something that will be helpful unless you've studied and understand everything else that has already been written about that specific problem? So, like, let's say you were going to write about climate change. If you don't do a literature review, then you're just going to blindly dive in. But if you actually do the study, then you might realize, okay, people have already studied temperature change in ozone. People have already written about how, these temperatures have changed over time. But then the real question is that temperature rising because of human intervention, or is it because of just some sort of natural cycle in the Earth's movements, for example? Okay, and then you would get into the debates of, why is it important to understand the differences between these two? And then you might look for a better research question, like, oh, can you link something to that. Like, can you link, human, factories and their CO2 emissions to rising temperatures? So your research question will get more and more refined as you study that literature. Now, this is also the same for humanities. When we're studying, whether it's film, like let's say you want to study the films of Kurosawa or something like that. If you don't do a literature review first, you're not going to understand what are the pertinent questions. You might be like, I'm going to write about why Kurosawa's films are so great. But it's like, okay, if you do a literature review, you might find that, okay, many people agree that, Kurosawa's films are great, but they don't agree about why it is that they're great. Some people might say it's the cinematography. Some people might say it's, it's cultural importance at that time. And so as you begin to understand those debates, it becomes clearer and clearer what it is that you need to be answering and how you will contribute to that field. Because you're no longer just writing for yourself. Okay? As a researcher, you're not just trying to understand something that you want to understand. You're trying to contribute to a global or, at least academic understanding of the importance of that text and its significance to some sort of perhaps practical problem. So you're formulating the problem and the research inquiry, and you're defining the value. All right? So another question is why would I want to read your study of Kurosawa? What is it? Why is it important for me to read what you? It's not just because, Kurosawa is interesting. You need to demonstrate that there is a gap in the research. Like, people have not understood Kurosawa from this particular perspective. Like, for example, okay, and I'm making this up because I have no idea. But let's say, for example, that everyone talks about how Kurosawa is such a great director, but actually, whoever wrote his screenplays is actually really, really important. And as you do the literature review, you're finding no one talks about that. And no one talks about its significance, especially to his canonical films, like The Seven Samurai or something like that. So only by doing the literature review can you identify what's missing and why it is that your research is important. Okay? Otherwise, you're going to be doing the same thing over and over again that someone else has already done, and you're not contributing anything new. Fourthly, I guess, you're comparing your findings with your own research. So if you read, let's say you have watched Kurosawa films and you've taken notes and you're like, the importance of the sun, the image of the sun, is really important in Kurosawa films. And you read other people's work and they're like, the importance of the sun we also think it's very, very important. You're comparing your findings. Okay? This is important, not just for corroboration, but also for seeing difference. If you differ from them, that's very significant. Okay? So ultimately, the literature review describes, summarizes, evaluates, clarifies, and or integrates the contents or primary reports. And it demonstrates the successful completion of the exploratory process. It maps out the field and it proves that you know and understand the field. So when I'm grading a dissertation, actually for me, the literature review is pretty much the most important thing because it demonstrates to me that this scholar actually knows what is important to analyze. And the stronger the literature review, then the stronger the analysis that comes later will be. Because it's already kind of sharpened, the kind of inquiry. A very strong literature review will lead to strong research. Because it really kind of sharpens the stick, you could say. It knows, exactly what it is that you need to be addressing. And what's the significance of that, of addressing it. So when you do the literature review, you begin to formulate the exact questions you need to be asking when it comes to your research. And a really good question is pretty much the majority of the battle when it comes to research, I think. All right. So another thing about this then is the question here is it's not just about what do literature reviews do, but how do you write a literature review? Okay. So when you're writing your literature review, you need to be addressing these things. What's the status quo? What's the problem? Okay? And why is it valuable to pursue that line of inquiry? And you need to use these citations or these sources to back up the reasoning. Okay? And it describes, summarizes, evaluates, or clarifies. So even though you may read a ton of work that might not really address the research question that you're asking, then that's not going to go into the literature review. That doesn't mean that it wasn't worthwhile to do that research. Half the time when I read, I'm not sure if this is really going to end up in my literature review. But it's still important to understand it, whether it goes into that kind of literature review or not, and how and whether or not it kind of addresses the research question. But you still have to do the research. That's part of your explanatory process. So overall, you're going to be, when you do a literature review, you're going to be walking your reader through your summary of the field so that they understand, the kind of direction that you're taking them in. Now, let's say you're like a tour guide. Okay, when you're doing a literature review, you're acting as a sort of tour guide, and the reader is your sort of client. They're the person they're the tourist who's going through. Now, as the tour guide, you're taking them on a sort of direction. You're telling them a sort of story about the field and what's going on. But you, as the tour guide, have actually seen much more of the field than what you're going to show them. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean, like, let's say you're taking them on a tour of Hong Kong, for example, and you want to design your tour in a way that is very much, addressing a specific research question. So your tour, your tour that you're taking them on could be like, what is the influence of British colonialism on present day Hong Kong? So then that means that you might not be taking them to the Hong Kong Geopark, or you might not be taking them to Ocean Park unless you can weave it into that kind of story. Now, that doesn't mean that you haven't been to Ocean Park. You do need to go to Ocean Park so that you know whether or not it fits into that question. Or also so you can evaluate other research questions. So that, for example, in this tour, you're doing a tour of the British colonial influence on Hong Kong. But the next one, you might be talking about, what are the sort of natural and environmental features of Hong Kong? Okay, so, but that doesn't necessarily go into that particular tour. Same the thing with your literature review. When you write up your literature review, your reader needs to know that there's a specific topic and a kind of goal that they're going through as they're going on this tour. Same thing, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that you don't study every aspect of Hong Kong that might end up, you needing to write about. But in the particular literature review for this particular dissertation, you are taking a reader on one in particular, okay? All right, so why do lit reviews matter? It enables your research to engage at a high conceptual level with other people's scholarship. Okay, so you're no longer in this kind of vacuum where it's like, I did a close reading of this movie or this book. Instead, you're going to do a close reading after you've read what everyone else has said about that book or that novel or whatever, in order to know what you're going to say is going to be different. So then it also enables you to see how your research contributes to knowledge and meaning. So not only are you finding out what other people have said, but you're also finding out how is it that what you're going to say could actually help other people understand the topic better. It also means that you're addressing the proper audience. You're working at the right level. Okay, so like those of you who do want to write about Kurosawa, and you do want to advance the field of Japanese cinema, well, you need to know what scholars of Japanese cinema are saying about it right now, because you could write this entire study about Kurosawa that all these people in Japanese film studies will be like, this doesn't matter. This is not important. We don't really care. Okay? Like, going back to our science example of environmental science, like, let's say you're like, the research question that I think will really, help us understand climate change is the temperatures, of, I don't know. I'm trying to think of something that would not apply. It's a little harder. I don't know. The body temperature of, human beings, have they gone up or gone down, in the last 20 years? Like, for a biologist, maybe this might be quite interesting, but for an environmental scientist, this might not really help them address their research question. The only way to know whether or not it really will help that field is to do the literature review. Lastly, like I said, it helps you stand on the shoulders of giants. Okay. So lit reviews help you become familiar with the conversation. Okay. So all scholarship is taking part in a conversation. It's a discourse. So you don't want to be talking to yourself. You want to be talking to other people. So this is the way to talk to other people is, first you have to listen. And after you listen, you need to be able to say, I know exactly what you mean. And I'm going to rephrase what you mean and recount it back to you through my understanding. And that will then help you address and talk with them. Okay? Have you ever had someone try to talk to you, but then they're not really listening to you, so you're not really having a conversation? That's like doing research without doing a literature review. When someone really is talking with you, the first thing that they can say is, okay, I think I understand what you mean. You're saying that, the way to understand climate change is to really understand the role of human industrial processes in changing the temperature of, or changing our climate. So with that in mind, then, I think that, and then this is where you would input your own intervention. You would say, well, then, with that in mind, I think that the best way to understand whether or not humans have are making an influence in climate change is to study temperatures after the Industrial Revolution, or something like that. Okay? So that means that you're actually part of the conversation as opposed to just interjecting something. And also, it helps you identify the appropriate research question. Like, I have not done a literature review on climate change, so I don't know if studies of the Industrial Revolution is what matters. Maybe we need studies of the data revolution and how, these server farms actually contribute to climate change. I don't know. Okay. Understand the nature of previous research and issues surrounding research questions. Find evidence to establish the need for proposed research. So this is really important, and this is why it is its own form of research. Is you need to establish to other scholars why it is that your study is important. Okay. So that means that when it comes to any type of research you do in the future, whether that's, a research that you're doing for some private consulting company, or if you're, writing up a research grant, you need to establish why it is that your research needs to be done. Okay. Because, right now the research that you're doing, pretty much the only resource used is your time. Okay. And your energy. But in the future, the research that you do will not just be about your personal time and energy, but it might cost money. People might need to invest in that research in order to get it done. Like, let's say you want to research, very hard to find archival texts, and you need to pay money to go in to look for that archive. Or, let's say you want to do some sort of research that examines teaching and how effective teaching is. You need to hire, researchers. You need to hire participants, in order to conduct this time. And you need to, justify that expenditure on the part of the university or the grant. In order to establish the need for that research, you need to write the literature review and locate the aporia. You need to say, this is what's missing. And you need to provide evidence that this is what's missing. Okay, so you can think of it as when you're writing a literature review. Okay, let's see if I can. Okay, I like to do this kind of graphically. So let's see if there's some sort of application I can use. Photo booth, preview, other, maybe some sort of paintbrush or something. Text edit, image capture. I probably should have thought of this beforehand. I'm sorry. Just give me a second. Let me find something. Oops. It used to be that in Microsoft you could use like Microsoft Paint. You can just draw things. But I don't know what to use in this case. Okay, let's just go back to using PowerPoint. Okay, so let's say, for example, right, not too happy using this, but whatever. Okay, picture, paint, right? Is this some sort of paint? No. Okay, I'll just use shapes, okay? So let's say, right, you are starting off in your research, right? You wouldn't just start off and just start kind of putting things in. You would want to kind of create a sort of framework for, why it is that you're justified in doing your research. So imagine that your research, you're using a kind of like lens. You're using some sort of magnifying lens to kind of identify something that's missing, okay? In order to know what's already missing, you need to know what's kind of full. So let's say that this is like a blank canvas and we don't know what's behind it. Imagine that all of this is just white, but actually there's stuff behind it, but we don't know. Okay. In order to understand what part of it you need to study, like this is your object that you want to research and you want to study, you need to see what other people have done. So for example, right, like let's say some people have already studied this object, which this is this kind of blank canvas, by looking at it as, like, oh, our research methodology is to examine it by making straight lines. So they've made a bunch of straight lines across this. They've created oh man, this is so much harder than doing this in class. Like, okay, no, this is going to take too long. Okay. There must be something I can use. Sorry. Okay, I'm just gonna Google something. Okay, paintbrush for Mac OS. Paintbrush is a reference. Mac Paint. Do I have to download it? Okay. All right. So I'll go back to that. Or I'm gonna pause and. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna pause this.